Dr. Kaldjian, thank you so much for being here. I'll let you take the stage.
Well, this first slide here, busy, I routinely disobey some of the PowerPoint rules about how many lines not to have on your slides. But you can see here that some medical practices are morally controversial. Right? We understand that. You can see some of the ones listed there. And there are actually many more. And even in some of the just bread and butter circumstances of healthcare that we get consulted on in our hospital, just the issue of when should somebody be kept alive versus being allowed to die? So questions of so-called medical futility. Very common in our ICUs, et cetera. And some doctors and nurses will actually feel very deeply compromised if they are forced in their minds to continue to participate in the patient's care. Or the alternative, if they think that people are giving up on a patient prematurely, they feel compromised by being party to that kind of decision making. But you know from reading, websites and just being a human being in our society that there are particular issues that are very vexed and contested, both ethically and legally in our society. And these issues are contested because they involve such fundamental issues. And you can see that in that parenthetic remark, it's really about ethics, and it's about what we refer to in medicine as goals of care, but even about concepts of health. I always find it interesting when I'm driving along the expressway and I see billboards advertising one or another healthcare system in all sorts of glowing, adulating sort of terms. The reference to health is if everyone knows what it is and there's nothing to be discussed. Well, we live in a society now where actually there are different concepts of health. That's sort of another related discussion. But it is quite striking to think that the differences sometimes go down so deeply that we really have different concepts, frameworks, visions of what constitutes health. So that's how serious it is. Some healthcare professionals object to participating in these sorts of practices that depending upon the person and the situation. And that is based on a deep sense of moral duty, involving conscience, integrity, ethics. You can see the kinds of words that I'm using regularly and almost interchangeably in terms of these big, deep ideas. But particularly the sense of duty. I'll be coming back to that. Because when we talk about interests, we should think about what interests do human beings navigate and negotiate among themselves that have to do with a sense of duty or obligation. And does that make a difference in terms of other kinds of interests people may have? Okay. And then also to keep in mind that these controversies affect pretty much any kind of a person in healthcare. And I have a particular sensitivity for our students and trainees. And I have conversations with them. They will not uncommonly come to me and say, hey, Dr. K, can I talk to you about X? And they start telling me the story and say, well, what do you think I should do about that? Because they feel really trapped and very disempowered in the hierarchical systems. And they're very concerned that if they speak up or make a request, that will be held against them in some way. So that's a very real concern. Right? So this idea of having to decide about what sort of total package of virtues are needed to be ready to speak, ready to have the courage, to have the honesty, the transparency, the decency, the kindness, to actually engage in ways that are constructive. So the public policy question involves a tension, right, between the rights of professionals versus the rights of patients. This is just putting it sort of very roughly, the whole thing, because it almost is too quick a way to get into a very polarized, antagonized sort of dichotomy or bifurcation. But one can at a certain level, because this is what courts end up having to do. They end up having to say on the one hand, on the other hand. So now are you going to bring this together or not? So on the one hand, the professional's right to have conscience protected from complicity or so-called cooperation. On the other hand, the argument would be that patients have a right to access a service, a medical practice that is desired by the patient, that's within the professional specialization, that's supported by at least some professional bodies, and that's legal. Right? There's just sort of a common sense that these are the two sort of contested aspects that are being considered. So the questions that I have running through my mind today are, first of all, it's going to be, what is conscience? And having spent a decent amount of time reading about conscience, I'm struck by the fact that people have been having differences of view on this question, not just for a few years, but for like 2,000 years. It's been going on for a while. So we're allowed to have our disagreements on what conscience is, if history is any reflection of that reality. But I also think, on the other hand, that despite the contrasts and disagreements, I think there's a fair amount of overlapping consensus. That whatever this conscience is, it's dealing with something really, really, really important. And I think it's sort of the thing that we know it when we see it, that we're the kind of creatures who have this built-in sense that this matters, and it matters deeply. I'm not saying everyone agrees with that, but I think there's a lot, I work with that sort of a basic conviction. And then the question, why should there be a right to practice medicine without violating conscience? And is conscience about personal beliefs, professional beliefs, or both? I'll certainly say both. And then in a morally pluralistic democracy, how do we balance the need to respect conscientious practice and provide access to practices that are legal, but also morally controversial? That's the kind of the policy question. So it's interesting to read people who've reviewed this topic and to realize, how differently different people can construe conscience in some of its basic features. And you see some of the contrast there. Some will think of conscience as the voice of God, others the voice of custom. Some think it's conscious, some think it's unconscious. Some think it's rational, basically. Some think it's emotional, basically. Some think that its dictates are obligatory, some advisory. Some believe conscience is fallible, some infallible. So there's a fair amount of variety out there, right? And in terms of why the disagreement, my sense, my understanding is that conscience is such a multifaceted reality that it's not surprising that there are different views of it from different perspectives, on the one hand. But more concerningly, I think, there are also competing perspectives based on different psychologies, anthropologies, ethics, politics, etc. So I think there are different reasons why people disagree about this. I think it's really helpful to listen in on both theological and philosophical discussions to appreciate more about the details, features, characteristics, the nuances of what conscience is. So just still by way of some introduction here, I'd like to emphasize that conscience has to do with, we can call our core moral convictions, whether religious or non-religious. And I often refer in my teaching with medical students and others to what I call foundational beliefs and values. It's interesting, in teaching medical ethics in the English-speaking Western world, the vast majority of the conversation happens in terms of four so-called principles of biomedical ethics: beneficence, non-maleficence, respect for autonomy, and justice. Each one of those, of course, to do justice to them, would have to be unpacked and justified. No small task, but the point is that most of that discussion happens sort of in this mid-level zone, where it's assumed that people generally agree on what those things mean. Right? We have a philosopher here in the second row, Professor Fales, who knows that we have philosophy departments for various reasons, and one of which is to really engage the question of, okay, whose principle or virtue or notion of justice? Is it basically a utilitarian one? Is it a Kantian one? Is it an Aristotelian one, et cetera, et cetera? So we can talk about these mid-level things, but then at a certain point, we have these foundations underneath them, right? I actually find, I think, Charles Taylor, the philosopher, talks about, in some of his writing, the ethics of inarticulacy, and how often many people just actually aren't even sure how to talk about their basics and their bottom lines. Where does their ethics come from? Right? There's a lot that's taken for granted. In one sense, which is fine, right? Because we're raised up in various communities, we're schooled in different ways of thinking, and we sort of know things when we see them. But the moment you now have to engage in a genuinely pluralistic environment, whether it's a small group or a large group or a society, now when you have to try to explain yourself and even take it upon yourself to try to persuade somebody to see something differently, what kind of reasons do we give? So conscience involves that degree of foundations. As I've already indicated, that these differences also involve basic beliefs about what health is, and therefore what healthcare is also. So I in my own understanding, there's no way I could separate conscience from ethics. Right? And so ethics, it has to do with ethics and ethical reasoning about what is right and wrong, good and bad. And it's very much not merely about private feelings. This is one of the dichotomies I perceive when I read certain writings in certain journals, especially medical journals, where those who are, shall we say, not supportive of a particular position that is being, at least in part, defended in conscience terms, I think are sometimes inclined to try to sideline or dismiss the conscientious objection by relegating it to the domain of personal feeling, private feeling, right? As opposed to the realm of reason. Because if it's in the realm of reason, now we have a conversation to have, as opposed to, well, it's just something private and interior. Okay, so that to me is really important. I'll come more to this role of reason. As I've already indicated, it also has to do with matters of obligation, duty, and responsibility. That I think is really important. And then I also like to talk in terms of conscience involving commitments that are deep enough to constitute our moral identity. I know that we live in a society, in a cultural moment right now, that makes a lot of identity, so-called identity politics. So I don't mean to be tapping into that idea, as vexed as it is right now, but I do mean to be talking about how we literally understand ourselves, and even the idea that I remember reading Bonhoeffer at one point when he's commenting on conscience, actually, and he's making the observation, this is in his book, I believe it's in Ethics, he talks about how the frequency with which people commit suicide when they have gone against their own consciences and they cannot bear it. Right? That's the idea, is can you sleep at night? Can you live with yourself if you don't follow your conscience? That's the issue of identity that I'm getting at here. It's that important. Okay, and I also tend to use the words conscience and integrity almost interchangeably, just because I think they're so overlapping in what they cover. I often like to go to the dictionary just to get a definition of something, right? And Webster's tells us that conscience is a sense or consciousness of the moral goodness or blameworthiness of one's own conduct, intentions, or character, together with a feeling of obligation to do right or be good. I find that a very helpful basic definition. And I also would just draw your attention in that first sort of box to say that that definition communicates something about moral perception, self-judgment, and obligation. So that's the terrain we're talking about here. And then when I think about competing interests, right, so the interests based in conscience of the health professional versus, say, the patient's interest in having access to a healthcare service, so-called, how do you navigate, negotiate these interests? The point I want to make at the bottom of that slide is to say that the interest on the conscience side is an interest that is defined by a sense of duty and obligation. And that, I would hope, in our society can be treated with special care. Because that's not just interest in the sense of, well, it's to my advantage in some way. I see the newspapers today are talking about our Iowa legislature and making some moves that would reduce your property taxes. So you have an interest in that, presumably, if you own property. And I'm not saying none of us, that you or I don't care about our financial interests. But this is an interest of duty or obligation that I think goes to a very deep level that is not just, say, where can you live in a more tax-friendly sort of jurisdiction, that sort of thing. May not be the best example, but I think you know what I'm getting at. So a few slides about the history of conscience. Some will point out that in the ancient sort of Greco-Roman world, there was an understanding of conscience as a universal human experience of inner pain related to actions that go against human nature. Then, going rather rapidly into Judaism and Christianity, those who are familiar with the Bible will appreciate that in the Old Testament references to the heart really could be understood very appropriately as being referencing conscience, right? Getting at the same basic core notion of who we are as human beings. And then in the New Testament, I would say that conscience is basically described as a divine endowment that allows us to recognize an objective moral order created by God and feeling obligation or duty. So here's one example, actually, from the Roman Catholic tradition, from Vatican II, actually. And you can see, as it says, in the depths of his conscience, man detects a law which he does not impose upon himself, but which holds him to obedience, always summoning him to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to his heart. Do this, shun that. For man has in his heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of man. According to it, he will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a man. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. Now, in terms of the Jewish and Christian traditions and their impact through Christianity on the Western world, this is, to me, a fascinating book. I confess I've not read anywhere near the whole thing yet, but I've particularly enjoyed the epilogue, which is a really wonderful summary. But it's written by an Oxford intellectual historian named Lauris Kaldjian. And he's actually talking about, as the title of the book shows, the very idea of inventing this thing we call the individual. Because prior to the Christianization of the West, the unit of value in society was what? The family. It was not the individual. So the individual now comes into play because now every individual gets their worth in and by their relationship with God. So God is the leveling sort of point of reference that now gives every individual this very special value. He argues, as an intellectual historian, that Christianity opposed the ancient world's assumption of natural inequality, established respect for individual freedom, invented the individual, turning the source of moral authority toward individual human agency and conscience, and created a role for conscience that set limits to the claims of any social organization. Very bold set of claims. I'm impressed by them. I of course resonate with them, but if any of you are interested in engaging that, that's a book worth a lot of time. Now some philosophical perspectives. I'm just going to offer three, which I think are very, very helpful and insightful. One is from Martha Nussbaum from the University of Chicago. I presume she's retired now, but I don't know that for a fact. And she talks about, in her book about liberty of conscience, the unique value of conscience, right? That she says, our moral and spiritual faculties, whether we call them conscience or soul or human dignity, deserve respect wherever they are found. And she says that conscience is an infinitely precious human characteristic that grounds human equality, demands universal respect, and justifies the argument for religious liberty and equality. Another really helpful book, if you want to read about the history of conscience, is by this man named Douglas Langston. And in it, he describes, eventually, after he's reviewed a remarkable breadth of history, he talks about conscience as a multi-dimensional reality. And that it basically is unique and it's an irreducible part of who we are as humans, and it involves intellect, will, memory, emotions, desires, and ultimate goals. And then the third person to mention is a philosopher named C.D. Broad. And in a very lengthy piece from the journal Philosophy, he goes into great detail in his argument and recommendation that we understand conscience as having three dimensions. Basically rational, emotional, and motivational. And I find that to be, I think there's a lot of consensus about that. And I would actually even suggest that if you think about the last time you were engaged by or engaging with your own conscience, I would anticipate that you would say it was a rational process. You were actually able to think about things like good and bad, right and wrong. You also felt certain things. You might have felt sort of at peace or satisfied, or you might have felt uneasy or guilty because your conscience was nagging, right? And then likewise, if your conscience was doing its fair work, you were motivated possibly to be reconciled, to rectify something, to make amends, right? So it's got these rational, emotional, and motivational aspects. And a bit more on that from C. Broad. You can see in the top part where I just add a little bit more about what he says about this first or cognitive or rational part of conscience. But the uptake for me is that if conscience involves a rational dimension, it means that it's part of our communication with each other. That it's never sufficient to say, well, my conscience says. period. Done. Now you just have to believe me, and we have no more to say. No, we should have something to say to explain. So the business of giving reasons, which I'll come to in a moment, is really important. It also means, though, that anytime we engage in dialogue, it means that we have to be open to what others have to say. And we have to be willing to be tested and challenged by what they say, right? And so it even means that we might have to be open, or we should be open, to revising our understanding. Because conscience, as I'll come to, can also be misinformed. And because it's got this rational element, it's definitely part of ethics. Another issue that comes up, and I'll be relatively brief on this, even though there's a lot to be said about it. I've been struck, as I've reviewed literature in medical journals that talk about conscience, is a willingness on the part of some people to say that, well, you can talk about different consciences in human beings, in particular in the healthcare context, so that you would have a professional conscience and a personal conscience. I confess, ever since the first time I came across this, it has not made sense to me. I understand, I think, what they're trying to communicate by that, but I disagree with it. Because I think if, one of the true things about human beings is that we are truly, or at least should be, integrated, unified human beings. And it's not as if, I remember hearing some people talk about how when they first got to medical school, they were told by some professor, oh, when you walk into the hospital, you have to park your own values and morals at the door. You have to come, you have to sort of take on this other set of values. I just don't think it's at all credible, actually. I don't think anyone can really do it, even if they wanted to. But certain things can happen. In any case, here are just a couple examples from folks who have actually tried to distinguish, I think unsuccessfully, between professional conscience versus individual conscience, or personal integrity versus clinician integrity. These are published in well-known sort of medical journals. Okay. Charles Taylor, I've mentioned his name again. The first one talks very powerfully, and I find very compellingly, about the need for a so-called undivided self, for a basic unity in the moral life, as we understand it. And then the second is from a wonderful, lengthy essay by Alistair McIntyre that talks about moral agency and the problem of compartmentalization. He uses sort of a story from the Nazi experience about people who just said, well, I was just doing my job. I never bothered to inquire as to who exactly was being transported on these trains and where to and why. Right? They're just doing their job. So they sort of compartmentalize their work life from their family life, after hours, etc. And he says that the problem with compartmentalization is humans basically become chameleons, right? You take on the color, the moral color of your environment, and your color changes based on your social setting. And that, again, goes against the idea of the unity of an individual moral life. There's a lot of discussion these days in healthcare about so-called moral distress, and it's where it's the basic understanding that you know, or at least you believe you know the right thing to do, but you're unable to do it because systems of power or hierarchy around you keep you from doing it. Say a nurse who feels trapped by the doctors who won't listen to what's really best for the patient, that kind of thing. So I think this is also a reflection of just how serious things can be when we are compromised or our integrity is undermined. I'm jumping around pretty fast here. I realize it's another big issue, an idea that is necessary for many in the tradition of the discussion of conscience to talk about, is a paradox. And that paradox is that on the one hand, for each of you and for me, your conscience for you, my conscience for me, is actually, in one sense, our highest authority. But it's not infallible, right? You might be wrong, I might be wrong. But the dictates of conscience basically represent your doing, my doing, our moral best. So you can't do better than your best. Of course, where your conscientious understanding comes from is another big question. Whether it's coming from your accurate perceptions of the world, whether it's coming from sacred scripture, from your favorite philosopher, from whatever best reasons or reasoning. And in that sense, it needs to be given an objective frame of reference, something outside of myself and just my own desires or feelings. So I would believe. But the point is that the problem of fallibility is there, okay? So we can say that though conscience is fallible, its conclusions are still authoritative for each individual because those conclusions represent the individual's best moral judgments. And that's why, you've heard it said, you should always follow your conscience, even if it happens to be, from some other perspective, objectively wrong. Right? And obviously, once you're persuaded that it's objectively wrong, you have an obligation to change what you thought. But the point is, that's why we hopefully teach each other, you need to follow your conscience. Okay. To address the problem of fallibility, we need a properly formed conscience, a properly informed conscience, and also humility. Right? So, if we need to rely on objective norms that give confidence without arrogance, a readiness to listen and learn, and a willingness to modify our judgments when we get better insight, etc. So there's quite a nuanced balance of that. But I suspect that we have all encountered people who actually are able to live this out. And they're wonderful people to be with and work with. All right. And related to the process of dialogue and of humility and how we interact with each other, I like to make simple reference to the goodness of giving reasons. Because sometimes I think reasons are in pretty short supply in the way that some things unfold in our society, both in public, but then also even within our organizations. And for all, I know sometimes in some of our families, people aren't talking, right? We need to give reasons. And I think when we give good reasons, we clarify our own thinking, we show respect and help the context of patients and colleagues. It invites feedback and critical assessment. It helps build consensus or at least clarifies disagreements. And it's also a great counter to the temptation, I'd say, to resort to mere power. Right? So the goodness of giving reasons could never be underestimated, I would suggest. So when it comes to healthcare professionals, how do doctors and nurses and others decide when their conscience might be compromised? In various traditions and folks have talked about different sort of key criteria. This is sort of my summary of it, to say that the issue at hand has to be sufficiently serious. There has to be a proximity between the moral agent, the person, and the thing itself. So there's a lack of proximity at a certain level, and I'm sure somebody might have some very rich thoughts about this, but the idea of our paying taxes to a government that does things you think are morally reprehensible. Okay, that's a pretty distant connection, right, between your paying taxes and that action somewhere in this country or somewhere else in the world, right? That's the idea of proximity, distance. So the closer it is, the more serious it is as well. And then intention. You know, it's one thing to pay taxes but not intend that bad thing to happen. It's another thing to pay taxes and delight in that thing happening because you wish that intention on the world, right? So are you there because you're constrained and forced, or do you actually intend to participate in whatever's going on? And then certainty in the moral sense. How sure are you that the thing that concerns you or troubles you or challenges you is genuinely wrong, right? Because there's certainly, I encounter plenty of situations in healthcare where people are genuinely challenged to figure out exactly what to make of a situation. Whereas in other cases, they know exactly what to think about it, but the real challenge is having the courage to do the right thing. Okay. So first we need to discern when to object to something, and then to discern how to respond once we're convinced that there's a problem, right? And in healthcare, usually it has to do with information, an explanation, or a so-called referral. So you can see how I've laid that out there. And I think that what's interesting about conscience too is that because conscience, even though I would certainly want to argue that it needs to be objectively grounded, at the end of the day, each person has to make a decision for him or herself. Right? So there's this, what I find interesting is that you could take the exact same ethical situation in healthcare and have a conversation with two different doctors or two different nurses, and you might get different conscientious conclusions. And some people, some third parties might say, no, that's legitimate, because different consciences are weighing different variables somewhat differently. Right? So it's not a one-size-fits-all, even though objectively speaking, we'd like to think there is a right answer and a wrong answer. But that's part of the nature of the moral life. Right? And that's why, at its best, a democracy allows for dissent when some people, based on the light of conscience that they have, decide to do or to disagree with something. The third one is an area, this issue of referral, that is particularly vexed in certain contexts. And I'm about to give two examples. And the first one is a generic one from the province of Ontario. The second one is specifically about what's referred to often these days as medical assistance in dying, which I refer to as physician-assisted suicide. And the second one's from New Mexico. So the first one here from Ontario, you can see a headline from the CDC there, about after the second litigation case that tried to counter what the law is. This is the law of the land in Ontario. If you are a clinician, if you have a moral objection to a practice, whatever it is, you have a legal responsibility to make an effective referral to another clinician who does not have that objection. Some of us human beings, and some of us healthcare professionals, actually believe that's still compromising. Even though I'm not literally the one doing the thing, that very official act of referral is participating in a chain of events that is leading to an outcome I cannot in any way participate in. For some people, even to talk about something would be a compromise as well. So people will draw those lines somewhat differently. This was litigated initially and then went to the Court of Appeal, the highest court in Ontario, and in both cases, the courts acknowledged that they were violating the religious liberties of these healthcare professionals, but they believed that the patient's access to the service was more important. So it was pretty bold-faced judgment, and that's the lay of the land in the province of Ontario. And I have some friends and colleagues who are practicing in Ontario, and it's a very heavy situation for them, because their licenses are literally at risk if they will not comply with it. By contrast, in New Mexico, if I recall correctly, I think New Mexico legalized assisted suicide just last year, but the original legislation did not have what was then just added, I believe, in March, where there was an amendment to the law that, as you can see, and then the amended text is down below from the PDF online, but it actually specifically says it affirms the right of individuals who object on conscientious reasons to participate, to provide information, and to refer. So this is a really nice, very concrete example of, in the realm of public policy and legislation, how one jurisdiction in Ontario goes one way, another in New Mexico goes another way. That's how real these questions are. And you can imagine how different doctors, if they have a choice to practice in different jurisdictions, and nurses would be more or less encouraged in either case. So a lot can be said about these things, but I just want to talk before I finish up here for a bit from the larger view. I've come across some writing, and I'm sure some of you have as well, about saying how important individual freedom of conscience is actually for the whole landscape of democracy and living together in a society. And there's a man named Lynn Wardle, who from Brigham Young Law School, and he writes in one of his works about the American founders who recognized the interdependence between virtue, democracy, liberty, religion, and conscience. And he writes, in order for virtue to develop in people, there must be liberty, especially freedom of religion and conscience. And he says, Madison, the founding father, clearly understood that if men are not loyal to their duty to their God and their conscience, it is folly to expect them to be loyal to mere legal rules, statutes, judicial orders, or professional duties. If you demand that a man betray his conscience, you have eliminated the only moral basis for his fidelity to the rule of law and have destroyed the moral foundation for democracy. So then he continuously addresses this question of this tension, right? Now still sort of coming back to what I began with, on the one hand, the professional's right of conscience, on the other hand, the patient's legal right to a legally otherwise available service. Lynn Wardle's take on this from his assessment, and I think that there's a lot of, I resonate with the validity of this observation, that in most cases, excuse me, health professionals and patients should be able to achieve respect for both rights of conscience and rights of access through information and communication systems established in advance. So, well-intentioned people of good faith, or in good faith as we could say, if they're trying to be creative to come up with policies that can basically meet the needs of both sides, a lot of good things can happen in society when people of goodwill are trying to work well together. But what do we do when we can't find that sort of shared or common ground? And some of you are familiar with this thing that goes by RFRA, right? RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that employs this legal notion of strict scrutiny. And it's a standard that says that government may substantially burden the free exercise of religion of a person or organization only if there's a compelling government interest and that it uses the least restrictive means possible to further that compelling interest. So I think that's just a description of where we are in our society today. It's interesting, the state of Iowa does not have a state-level RFRA, but the state is under the federal level. There are certain, I know some people in this state would very much like to see Iowa have this as well, so there would be added protections. Because just because you have a statute like this doesn't mean it's enforced. That's a whole other discussion. Okay, so just a last couple slides here. So when you're trying to engage the policy tension in a pluralistic society, I would emphasize these among other things, but accommodation, transparency, and alternative access. And I think if we can try to promote these things, we will live better together, and we will do more justice, I believe, to how serious and precious really conscience is. Okay, and so in summary then, or in closing, I think a claim of conscience communicates a serious and steadfast moral conviction involving a duty, a moral obligation, integrity, our moral identity, the need for respect from others, conscience rights, and expectation of explanation to others, and communication of reasons. So once again, that connection you can see pointed out between duty and rights. It's not just any interest we're talking about. This is an interest that has to do with our sense of ourselves as moral agents whose very identity and sense of ourselves as persons depends upon the sense of moral obligation and being consistent with our best understanding of that obligation. So conscience should be understood as a fundamental part of our lives, engaged as part of ethical reasoning, respected as a right in a morally pluralistic democracy, and sustained, I believe, for the flourishing of health professionals, patients, and society. So thank you.
Go ahead and open for questions.
Yes, please.
I got a question on just how should someone distinguish between what is a matter of conscience versus bigotry and discrimination, specifically on some of the controversial topics, for example, gender dysphoria surgery, maybe abortion.
Yeah, in one sense, it's a fundamental question about the nature of a position or a reason. So I guess I would quickly probably go to the dictionary and remind myself what is the best definition of bigotry. And then I would compare it with a definition of ethics or ethical reason. Right? So it's a matter of giving reasons. And I think, my sense is that often, certain pejorative ad hominem labels are used basically to attack people whose positions you disagree with. Sadly, that's just a part of human nature and the environment that sometimes we may find ourselves in. And so I think the task before us is to give our best reasons. And so I think this is where healthcare is really, really helpful, because it's not abstract, it's very real. So, for instance, I use the example of assisted suicide. It's really interesting and disturbing to think that doctors can be the kind of people, like all of us are as human beings, who some of them will say, well, yeah, actually actively facilitating the death, or if I can use the word, the killing, the self-killing through suicide of a patient is part of the compassionate practice of medicine. It's part of healthcare. the AMA still says in one of its opinions that assisted suicide and euthanasia are contrary to the healing nature of medical practice, to the physician's role as healer. So how can doctors disagree on such a fundamental question? Well, they do, right? So you all as patients, I as a patient, we might want to take that into consideration when you're wondering what kind of a doctor you want to care for, right? So the question is, I mean, I don't know if bigotry would come into play on the disagreement of assisted suicide, but I suppose it could if somebody just wants to use gruff language sort of thing. But what I would hope is that when people have a deep disagreement, because for instance, in that debate, both sides believe they're on the side of respect and compassion. It's really interesting, right? So I think what we would hope for ourselves is that we would have conversations with each other, and in which we would explain ourselves and say, listen, we're actually both wanting to serve the patient to the best of our ability. And we have different visions about what that looks like. And I think when this gets into the realm of these foundational beliefs and values, it involves very different views about what to do with the problem of human suffering. Right? So to put it bluntly, some would say that assisted suicide and euthanasia finally address the problem of suffering by eliminating the sufferer in a biological sense. And others would say, we must do all that we can, we must have better palliative care, all these other things, and show genuine love and respect for the people who are suffering, as opposed to just, wiping our hands of it once we're satisfied that we've outlawed assisted suicide and saved Iowa, sort of thing, right? I mean, genuine commitment to people in their suffering. Is that getting someplace to an answer for you?
Yeah, a lot of times you hear the term you're discriminating against a people group rather than wanting to talk about difference in consciousness. And I just, when you are confronted with that, how do you handle it in an appropriate way?
Thank you, and that just reminds me to say, so this is something that's quite clear, actually. I find it really important when talking about this with healthcare professionals who have concerns about certain practices that might be legal in a certain jurisdiction but they disagree with. It's so important to distinguish between an intervention and a person. So if there are certain things you won't do, like intentionally killing a patient, or performing an abortion, or doing assisted reproductive technologies, or doing sex change type operations. You can say those procedures I don't do, but I want to care for any patient who has a healthcare need. And so I'm not discriminating against any class of individuals, because that will be taken very seriously in our society, and at a certain level, rightly so. But if you just say, no, my practice of medicine doesn't include certain procedures. And now, it's a little more nuanced than that, because there are certain things, you brought up the transgender question. Take a mastectomy, right? There are surgeons who perform mastectomies to treat as part of the treatment for breast cancer. So they're literally doing that procedure, but they're saying, I won't do it. It's not as much so for other persons, but rather for other reasons. But then your point is well taken. In our society, in the back and forth of the kinds of things that are said, the contention is made that, well, you're discriminating against me rather than just saying certain procedures you won't do. Right? So but I think that can be reasoned. I think it stands to reason. We can describe the practice of medicine in ways that are not, it's not hard to, I think, actually have a justified position that says, these things I can do for under these circumstances, for these reasons, but not these over here. Yeah. Evan, were you going to say something?
I have a comment and a question. They're actually related, though it won't be obvious that they are. The comment was just, you had some opposition early in the lecture. You had these oppositions and to characterize conscience, and at the top of the list you had will of God, I think it was, versus custom, right? And I just wanted to mention that there's a third option. And that option is encouraged by a lot of evidence that we're acquiring about certain social species of animals that seem to learn and follow what we might call roughly moral rules. Tit for tat, generosity, friendship. All of these, we have pretty good attestation of trust. And so that's the third option.
Right, and actually, let me just say, just by way of clarification, I didn't put all the, another version of that slide, I have the actual names of the individuals within that review article or chapter that who had actually made those claims. I wasn't suggesting that's the only way to dichotomize it.
Okay.
I was just sort of giving examples of the flavors of how people disagree so much. But would that be then sort of maybe almost sort of maybe a neo, but also no, would it be like a neo-Darwinian sort of approach, or a genetic, or sort of a nature versus nurture kind of thing?
I would say so, but
Yeah.
there may be other ways of articulating it.
Right, right.
Now, my question, and this is something that has puzzled me or troubled me or made me think for a long time, is to what extent are moral differences between people? Mind you, there's a very broad range of agreement about certain things among the human members of our species. But where there are differences, to what extent might they be predicated on differences in factual beliefs? And to what extent is there a separable component that we might call the moral component per se? And what role can reason play, and what role can it play in trying to achieve some sort of agreement to debate factual disagreements?
Yeah, no, and I think, isn't people like C.S. Lewis, and I'm sure you know many philosophers who have addressed this, and I'm trying to scroll back to think about whether William Franklin, in his book Ethics, the philosopher, whether he addresses this too, because people who will sometimes make rather full-throated claims about how different cultures are across the world, and there's more differences than that. I agree with you, Evan, that it's quite striking how much is in common when it comes to basic beliefs about murdering people, about marriage and family, the treatment of children, stealing, lying, these fundamental things that if we don't have them in society, it's gone. The fact is that most cultures have their versions or understandings of those ideas. And I think that people like C.S. Lewis and others would very much say that, yeah, the places of disagreement are very engageable via reasoning. So if things are pointed out in certain ways, or also if the social circumstances were to change, that sometimes by changing the rationale, it's not hard to get someone to change their position, because now they no longer have the same reason they had before. So I think this is a very nice example of just showing how reason is constantly in the mix of how we negotiate and navigate, and that's why it's really important to keep it as part of conscience, so that whenever somebody makes a conscience claim, it's an opening into an engagement rather than a shutting off. Thank you. Comments, questions? Yeah, Will.
Earlier in and thank you very much for the presentation. Very helpful to lay out the different components that compose the conscience and different ideas of how it's understood. At one point in the conversation, you mentioned Taylor and that instance articulating the source of our morals. And in particular, one of the things he stresses is the articulation of these hypergoods. These ultimate ends, these final ends, these ultimate goals that we're directing ourselves to, that there's a kind of directionality to the self, and therefore I'm sure a kind of directionality to the conscience, that it's directed towards, whether or not we've ever made that explicit, implicitly we're directed towards a particular hypergood, a particular notion of flourishing. And I'm curious, especially in a pluralistic society, it strikes me that one of the key things that would characterize that pluralism is just a range of different notions of flourishing, a range of different hypergoods. And what role does that play in arbitrating between maybe conflicts of conscience, disagreements that physicians might have, that ultimate flourishing that we're directed to, which could be conceived as very different from physician to physician?
No, I think that's, in my mind, that's another way of talking about what moral pluralism really is, right? These are different visions of flourishing at a certain level. And then you have someone like John Rawls who will make reference to an overlapping consensus. So to a large degree, human beings, we all here in Iowa City as well, we can agree on some things that are conducive to human flourishing for everyone. And we pay taxes in the hope that those interests are furthered, etc. At the same time, there's also, some of you might know the work of Nicholas Wolterstorff, who has spoken here through the Geneva series, probably twice at least. And he makes reference in one of his books to a politics of multiple communities. It's not necessarily a bad thing, just as a reality. So there's a sense in which, why would one ever sort of envision that possibility? Well, it's for those who do not prefer a statism that just imposes one vision on everyone, but acknowledges that within reason, whatever that phrase is going to be taken to be, we need to allow freedom for human beings and their consciousness to live according to different visions of the good, right? And so some people, some philosophers will spend a lot of time describing the difference between sort of what is higher, the good or the right. And so we're, by and large, in a more proceduralist, ethical, legal culture that decides how we're going to decide rather than what should be decided. And you see this in healthcare. And this happens a lot in our hospital, every hospital. A patient is really sick and they're incapacitated. They cannot make decisions for themselves. And the team doesn't know what to do because we need a decider. We don't have a decider. 50 years ago, that wasn't an issue, right? So even, I don't know if you've come across this, but in healthcare, someone would say an unattended or unbefriended patient. Those are the terms that are used to describe someone who doesn't have a surrogate decision maker. And so it's as if the people kind of get paralyzed because we so focus on patient autonomy. You are the chooser. Suddenly you can't express your choice. Now what do we do? Now, of course, now what I also say to the students and to others is, you know that you think you know what's good for your patient. You have a sense of what is healthy and what on average is good for human flourishing. So I actually think that healthcare professionals are far more influenced by their prior notions. And in fact, getting to some other sort of waters here, but in the process of shared decision making, have you ever wondered what some doctors might not be telling you because they've already decided that's not a good option for you? So they give you the other options that they think are more legitimate, right? They're already sort of guiding things unbeknownst to you. So we are constantly, when you think about those so-called four principles, beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice, those first two, those are the traditional, those were in the Hippocratic Oath, basically. And they were sort of the reigning medical practice for about 2,000 years. And then you get patient autonomy and notions of distributed justice. But those notions of what's good and what's harm, doctors and nurses are constantly working with their own understanding of what that is. And in fact, it's really bothersome to many professionals when the patient sees it otherwise. It leads to some real tension. So these different visions of the good are really, they're there all the time. One of the more common slides I use in my teaching has 4 arrow sort of blocks. And it's very much a trajectory. A test or treatment, a goal of care, a concept of health, and flourishing. So, you know, if you take a virtue-based understanding, whether it's Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, there's, you know, Aristotle had his notion of eudaimonia, right? The flourishing, the call it happiness, whatever it will. And Thomas Aquinas is the scientific vision, you know, the Westminster Confession, and it's, you know, what is the purpose of man and woman, right? To glorify God and join forever. We have these different sort of notions of what flourishing really is. Medicine, by and large, doesn't deal with it, right? I've never listened to a doctor talk to a patient and said, man, my friend, I'd like to talk to you about your flourishing, right? So instead, we tend to talk about your health. Usually don't define it, but more commonly, we talk about if we're good at shared decision-making and informed consent, what's the purpose of this test or intervention? And you might be thinking, well, what do I mean by these goals of care? I've got 7 of them memorized with 7 letters that serve as a mnemonic. CLF, CLFC. This is how I teach medical students. Forgive me if I'm making you feel like you're back in medical school, even though you never most of you. In any case, cure, live longer, function, comfort. Life goals, family, clarify diagnosis or prognosis. These are literally actionable goals that we actually, even in our palliative care service, even in the template they use on the Epic electronic record, actually use those categories to try to find out what's most important to this patient, which is a goal orientation rather than an intervention focus, rather than saying, well, would you want to be transferred to the ICU or not? Do you want us to resuscitate you or not? Do you want a transplant or not? That's so common. We're so means-oriented rather than ends-oriented. But the end is a more proximate, non-ultimate end. The flourishing is that ultimate. By and large, I would say that the flourishing is sufficiently contested that we tend not to go there. I think probably, if maybe some of you have been blessed by this, you might have had such a good relationship with a doctor or nurse that you were actually able to talk in such terms about your understanding of your flourishing or your calling, however you want to put that. And that was able to infiltrate, as it were, the process of shared decision making. But by and large, it's more upstream, more proximate, rather than more ultimate. Does that work?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Okay.
Dr. Kaldjian, thank you so much. I would love for a doctor to say to me, let's talk about your flourishing. And to feel seen as whole people, you know. And one of the things I wrote down that you said is whenever someone engages in a conscience claim, it should be an opening for engagement and not a closing. And I really appreciated that and want to move forward with that in mind when I make conscience claims, but also when I hear them from others. So thank you so much. Thank you for your amazing questions. Feel free to stay and chat, and we have some cards if you'd like to sign up for our Geneva's newsletter to get information about more events like this. Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause.